So there's this weird part of the Torah's portion tomorrow morning, sandwiched between the story of Abraham sending out his beloved son Ishmael with his mother Hagar, and that whole story of how Sarah treats her in chapter 21. Sandwiched between that and chapter 22, which is known as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where Abraham doesn't send his son away, but goes with him up the mountain towards his almost binding. At the end of chapter 21, we have a really strange story about a king named Avimelech and his relationship with Avraham. We've kind of found this character, Avimelech, earlier in the Torah. Avimelech is a person who has already been involved with Avraham and with Sarah. And here the story kind of comes back again, and it's sandwiched right there at the end of chapter 21. And the challenge was write a Dvar Torah about this weird moment between Avimelech and Abraham. What happens, of course, is that Avimelech and Abraham will have some energy between them, some relationship. Avimelech was very angry at Abraham because Abraham didn't tell Avimelech earlier in the story in Genesis that Sarah was his wife, and he was really angry at him because he almost slept with her. Some strange thing going on with Avimelech, and it comes back here at the end of chapter 21, and it says, and it was at that time that Avimelech and Fichol is the head of his army, they came to Avraham and they said to him, God be with you in all that you do. Please swear to us by God, they say to him, that you won't lie to us or to our ancestors or to our descendants, our children, our grandchildren. Do with us chesed, loving kindness with us. And Avraham says, okay, I'll be with you that way. They come and they say, we'd like to offer some moment of reconciliation. We've seen that you've grown. You're now Avraham. You're not just Avraham. You have Isaac. There's going to be a lineage from you. And we're here to make some kind of relationship happen. And so Avraham says, okay, I'll swear that we'll have some relationship going forward. And then chapter 21, verse 25, interrupts this wonderful reconciliation between this strange character, Avimelech and Avraham, to tell us that Avraham had a little business to take care with Avimelech before they could go forward. So verse 25 tells us, V'hocheach Avraham et Avimelech al odot be'er hamayim asher gazlu avdei Avimelech. So I'll promise you that certainly from now on we're going to be in relationship, Avraham says to Avimelech. But just one moment before we go forward, I need to give you a little rebuke. I need to chastise you. V'hocheach Avraham et Avimelech. And Avimelech now receives a rebuke from Avraham about some water, some well that the servants of Avimelech have stolen. So Avimelech receives the rebuke and says to him, Lo yadati, I had no idea. Mi asat, I didn't know who did this. It wasn't brought to my attention. V'gam ata lo yadati, and by the way, you never told me. And I didn't hear from it at the water cooler. On this, there's a remarkable midrash in the Sifrei. V'hochech Avraham et Avimelech, and Avraham rebuked Avimelech. Hatochecha mevi'a lidei shalom. That rebuke and chastising, criticism given well, feedback given well, can bring us to peace. Shalom, shalom. And then the midrash, the rabbinic folk, quotes this story. You see, at the end of the story, in a couple of verses, the two of them are going to actually make a covenant. After this rebuke, there will be a covenant, and the covenant will be known as the covenant that took place at the Well of Seven, Be'er Sheva. The name of that very city, Be'er Sheva, the Well of Seven, is from this story at the end of chapter 21, where two people who were at some point had some energy between them, maybe a Facebook post that they didn't like, or some kind of something happened. Avraham is pissed off at Avimelech, and Avimelech is pretty angry at Avraham. And we interrupt this beautiful reconciliation on national TV in this to say, V'hocheach Avraham et Avimelech. And Avraham said, before we go forward, I got to lay it out on the line. I just got to tell you what I've been holding. Because what I've been holding has been holding me. What I've been holding has been holding me back from really being in a real relationship with you. And so the Sifrei, this beautiful Midrashic corpus says, you know, rebuke can bring us to peace if administered well, and that's, of course, the question. And the Talmud brings this as a question. Does anybody know in our generation, the Talmud says, how to give rebuke? Does anybody here know how to give rebuke in the right way? Or in maybe Harvard Business Review language, does anybody know how to give constructive feedback? Does anybody know how to say to somebody, that post really hurt me? Does anybody know how to say that what you did and what you spoke really, really makes it hard for me to be in relationship with you, and I have to clear the air? And here are the rules around tochecha, around rebuke. I won't make it personal. I won't make it about you. But I won't lose the personal because there is a you there. I will say it cleanly and clearly. There'll be a way for reconciliation to take place. It will lead to peace because the way that Avimelech hears it, he says, you know what? If that's really true that happened, wow. I can't believe they stole a well. Avimelech's like, I didn't know. And Avraham might have been saying, well, what do you mean you didn't know? You didn't see the email that said that your servant stole? He said, I didn't know. And Avraham here doesn't haggle with him. He doesn't handle with him. He doesn't stay. The next verse doesn't say, and Avraham said back, well, you should have known. How could you throw up your hands? So here, in this moment between the sending out of Yishmael, where Avraham does not go with Yishmael, his beloved son, but says to Sarah, you know what, you take care of it. We would have hoped that Avraham, earlier in chapter 21, would have said to Sarah, you know what, I'm not so sure I like the way that you're handling this. It's not really so cool, like your employee handbook does not include what you're doing to Hagar. We would have loved to have that Avraham show up on the scene. And maybe Avraham here finds his voice. Maybe that's the reason why Avraham, in the very next moment in chapter 22, even though we wish he would have said to God, I'm not interested in taking my son, at least he walks with him. Something in Avraham has been born in him. He's more responsible. He's more vocal. Who knows? But one can't read this on the Shabbat that is this Shabbat without, of course, thinking of some of the relevant moments now around us in our culture and wherever we are. One of the most remarkable moments at the end of chapter 21 is that Avraham will make a covenant of peace with Abimelech, and then as a sign of something, Avraham plants a tree in the area of, in the area where the 7 wells are. And the Zohar in the 13th century says, what is that tree that he planted? He planted the tree of life. Dahu eitz hachayim. Somehow there was something in Avraham and in this relationship with Avimelech where true peace happened, the tree of life could be planted, vitality could reemerge. On October 27th, 3 years ago, this week, another tree of life was brought to our attention in the most horrific way. Just 3 years ago, a tree of life that was planted not as a symbol of peaceful coexistence and of peace and of safety and security, but rather the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh was violated and desecrated. The killer, of course, who perpetrated the worst act, the most heinous act of Jew hatred in American history, was angry at the Tree of Life, he said, because they had, the week before, been a part of a Shabbaton for Hayas, the Hebrew organization, the Jewish organization that welcomes refugees and brings strangers in. The rebuke tonight that I hope and pray would lead to peace is a rebuke to all of us who sit comfortably while organizations like the one that was supposed to be at the voter registration rally tomorrow but pulled out because of all things the reform movement, which is Zionist, was slated to participate along with 2 other organizations at the rally. And so in protest, an organization that is an environmental organization pulled out in protest because people who identified as Zionists or an ideology or an organization like the URJ, which is at the forefront of progressive things in Israel and peacemaking, couldn't stay in the room with them, couldn't coexist with them. Just 2 years ago, when I stood not here but across the street, and I gave a sermon that I titled Flying Our Flawed Flags in honor of a great man, I wondered aloud no differently than Amanda Gorman did at last year's inauguration, where she said, our country is not perfect, but it is a work in completing that imperfection and bringing it to perfection, completing that poem, completing that story. I said, all of our flags are flawed. Nationalism has its deep structural problems, but I proudly stand here as a rabbi saying that I won't cower under the cover of maybe he's a Zionist or not, that I am a Zionist, but you are welcome to come to Romamu with all that you don't agree with and stay in the room with us. And stay in the room with us. And people got up and left the room. And I sat with those people for 2 hours or 3 hours on a Wednesday night just to listen to them. And I kept saying, yes, but we're a synagogue. The state of Israel is a fact. To try to erase Zionists is to try to erase Jews, real people who live there. V'hochiach Avimelech, Avraham and Abimelech. And on the way to peace, Avraham stood up and said, I know we're on the way to peace, but I just got a little bone to pick with you, Avimelech, because without rebuke and without standing up and speaking the truth, without saying that we can't abide people trying to erase Jews, when Jews are trying to lift up and see everyone, the same Jews who are trying to lift up the world, sometimes we say, okay, it's okay if they erase us. To be a proud Jew. And in being a proud Jew, say, I'm proud as a Jew, and you can be proud as you, as who you are. Gay, straight, queer, trans, Palestinian, Pakistani, as last night some of the kids were Pakistanis. Pakistanians, all peoples have the right to be and to speak. And how ironic it is that the very organizations that were protested by this environmental organization that pulled out are themselves at the forefront of trying to advocate for Palestinian rights and for Palestinian voices. But of course, that's what happens. So tonight, this strange story sandwiched between one moment of injustice and another one where Avraham finds his voice, and the Midrash says, "Hatochecha mevi'ah lidei shalom." To be able to speak up for the sake of peace, for the sake of reconciliation, for the sake of being true and being real. So I'm blessing, whether it's in a small community, a big community, within a family, within a friendship, to be able to find the right way to say what needs to be said. To say it with compassion, to say it with love, to say it for the sake of the relationship itself, and to say it not to divide, but to unify. There are some people out there who are just constantly looking for ways to divide and divide and divide. To rebuke is not to divide necessarily, but to bring up and to allow to be seen that which needs to be seen for the sake of covenant, for the sake of peace. May the one who makes peace above bring peace here below through healthy, powerful, honest, constructive tochecha feedback for the sake of us, for the sake of our people, and for the sake of all peoples. And let us say amen.
Amen.